Ahead and get started. I got to apologize. My laptop is a little too old to use Zoom background, so this is a real look you're getting at my refrigerator right now. But thank you all for attending. My name is Alex Layton, and I am president of the American Constitution Society here at IU Maurer School of Law. Before we begin anything, it's important that we're all aware that today is a national day of mourning for all the Black and brown lives lost to police violence in this nation. So wherever you're zooming in from, please join me for a brief moment of silence. All right, thanks everyone. I also need to provide a quick cybersecurity disclaimer before we begin this event. Yesterday, the IU Conversation for Racial Justice and Peace was hacked and bombed with a bunch of crude images and messages. I don't foresee that happening because one, we didn't advertise to as big of an audience as that conversation. And two, I have set up some security measures around this Zoom meeting. But in the event that does happen, please don't subject yourselves to that. Just go ahead and leave the meeting. We'll find a way to get this presentation to you. Whether we have to record it and email it to you, we'll just find a way. But going forward with the presentation, on the agenda today, we'll have some words from our hosts, presentation by our guest speaker, David Frank, and then a question and answer session to follow. I'd like to thank the Black Law Students Association, the Latinx Law Student Association, and the Asian Pacific American Law Student Association for hosting this event. We'll go ahead and hear some opening remarks from leaders of those organizations.
Thank you, Alex. I'm Gray Jung, and I'm the president of the Asian Pacific American Law Student Association at the IU Maurer School of Law. On behalf of the organization, I would like to express our solidarity with the victims of terrible recent tragedies. The killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd were senseless murders committed by law enforcement officers. They point to a larger systemic problem of inconsistent rules of engagement used by police officers against members of communities of color. More importantly, we would like to express grief for the families of the victims. Our thoughts and prayers go out to them, and our hearts ache for the pain and suffering that they must be going through right now. As minorities, we must come together during this difficult time. And specifically, as Asians and Asian Americans, we should appreciate and be passionate about issues that concern other minority groups. When different minority groups can support one another and care about one another, I think we will be able to see something big happen. We'll be able to influence mainstream society. Black lives matter, and we stand with Black persons across the nation. And finally, we would like to extend a huge thank you to the National Lawyers Guild for hosting this training session on such a short notice, and we hope to further educate ourselves through this event. And with that, I will now be handing off to Michael Hernandez, President of the Latinx Law Student Association, for further remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gray. One second. Good evening to everyone joining us tonight. My name is Michael Hernandez, and I am the president of the Latinx Law Student Association at IU Maurer School of Law. LLSA is committed to uplifting all affinity groups and minority students at the law school. Collaboration and unity are priorities for our organization. Latinos are racially and ethnically diverse. African roots run deep in Latin America. Many of the most cherished aspects of our culture would not exist without the contributions of Afro-Latinos. Non-Afro-Latinos must confront anti-Blackness in our communities whenever it arises. Historically, Latinos across the United States have suffered from police brutality and systemic racism. LLSA is committed to raising awareness of the ways the criminal justice system ravages communities of color and organizing actions such as this one to help fight back. I will now give the floor to Ayana Gotzel, President of the Black Law Students Association, for further remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ayana Gotzel, and I am the president of the Black Law Students Association. I want to start by thanking ACS, LLSA, and APALSA for co-hosting this event, the National Lawyers Guild for taking the time to provide this crucial training, and to all of you for being here with us tonight. Unity and solidarity are the best weapons against systemic racism and oppression. Frankly, none of us are free unless all of us are free. That is why this fight against oppression must continue even after the media finds a new topic of breaking news. We must be intentional and consistent in our support of one another, and we must continue to do all that we can to push forward change. I hope this event, like many other events all over the country, is the start of a future where true equality is the standard and where we always stand united. So thank you all again for being here. Before I hand it back over to Alex, I want to remind everyone of the Black Lives Matter protest tomorrow at 3 p.m. at Dunn Meadow. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for those words. That was very well put. We'll now turn to our keynote speaker from the National Lawyers Guild, who will be training us to be effective legal observers during what will be another weekend full protest. Joining us today is David Frank, who is the president of the National Lawyers Guild, and he has a long history as a civil rights attorney in the Midwest. After graduating from Ohio Northern University College of Law, Mr. Frank provided legal services for Safe Horizons and then went on to perform civil rights work for Myers and Associates. More recently, however, Mr. Frank has specialized in poverty law for Indiana Legal Services and now does immigration rights for the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic in Fort Wayne. With that being said, please welcome Mr. David Frank.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I'm just asking. I'm broadcasting live from my home, so if you hear the wailing of a 4-year-old child or a 6-year-old cat, that's why, okay? Thank you, I have to say, to Alex and IU Maurer and all the groups that came together to do a Know Your Rights and Legal Observer training. We find it's effective to kind of combine both of those trainings just because there's so many overlapping issues. We have legal observers, potential legal observers who are both or one or the other. So, but either way, it's good to know what's necessary background to have for either, particularly as protesters and legal observers are coordinating often. I'm going to now attempt to share my screen. We'll see how that goes, and just so we can kind of walk through the PowerPoint. There's a number of slides to go through, but if at any time anyone has questions, please feel free to ask. If there's, and I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions afterwards. So let's see here. Okay. All right. Let's just want to make sure we can got these okay. We'll try this again. All right. Let's see. Okay, so can we see the screen okay? The PowerPoint okay? All right. I'm sharing my screen, so I'm just looking at the slides now. So if anyone has anything to speak up or let me know. I'm just going to start with the standard disclaimer here. This information is provided for general informational purposes. I'm not speaking as anyone's particular attorney or addressing anyone's particular legal concern. With this, I'm just trying to provide general information. That doesn't mean that a guild attorney or another attorney doesn't represent you now or in the future, but this is just for general informational purposes. Um, so, and again, so hopefully what we are able to do is to prepare you to be an effective legal observer, and also help alert any attorney, any demonstrators or protesters of their rights. So with that said, we'll get started here. First of all, you have the, starting with the Know Your Rights side, we have, when you're at a protest or a demonstration, again, just for background, whether you're a protester or a legal observer, it's good to know that just generally speaking, you have the right to speak in a public forum, in a public space. Speak, I mean that in a general sense, whether that's, of course, vocalizing dissent or engaging in any of their acts of expression. In a public forum, without getting into the legalese too much, that is a space where people are generally entitled to be. Kind of the archetypical examples are a park or outside of a courthouse, on a sidewalk, many times synonymous with a public space. Going over the next slide. And again, if anyone has anything, please speak up, or has any questions. I'm just looking at my my screen here. So you have the right to gather peacefully in a group and in a public space. There, of course, can be certainly restrictions that are put on that, but generally speaking, that is the starting place. Of course, those rights can be curtailed or modified under certain circumstances. That might be either federal law, state law, city ordinance, or a particular order at a time. And those, of course, can not only be curtailed by state authorities, public authorities, but also by private authorities. You have the right to peacefully demonstrate, is assumed, but that does not necessarily that doesn't include the right to engage in prohibited conduct, whether that's disorderly conduct. An issue that we've seen arise recently, or at least and even criminally alleged, or to participate in rioting, or to commit criminal mischief, which is another word for property destruction, or to obstruct traffic. If you do, you can be subject to arrest. All right. You do not have the right to trespass on private property, and you do not have the right to remain on private property after you've been asked to leave. If you do, you can be also subject to arrest. Criminal trespassing. Criminal trespassing is, for lack of better terms, and I'm going to kind of summarize some of these slides here, just so we can get through the presentation and answer any questions in an effective time and manner. Criminal trespassing is essentially where you're not allowed to be, or where you're at when you've been asked to leave. And that can be either on private or public property. That generally is a misdemeanor, but it can be a felony if if the trespass is on certain property. That includes school property, agricultural, the property of and premises of agricultural operations. Disorderly conduct, that's a criminal charge. It's typically a misdemeanor. It's very broad, and it's along with resisting arrest, it's a very oftenly charged crime that entails recklessly knowing or intentionally engaging in fighting or tumultuous conduct. making unreasonable noise and continuing to do so after being asked to stop. If it is a disrupting, and that includes also disrupting a lawful assembly. Again, that's usually a misdemeanor. If the definition looks like it's broad, it is. Again, it can be anything that a officer wants it to be, more or less. That doesn't mean the charge will stick, but if you're acting in a manner that a police officer doesn't like, they will, and they want to arrest you. This is kind of a go-to charge, again, along with resisting arrest. Rioting, that's essentially disorderly conduct in a group. Again, that's typically a misdemeanor, but if you're armed with a deadly weapon, or alleged to be armed with a deadly weapon, which can be a firearm, but anything can be more or less categorized as a deadly weapon, that can become a felony. Criminal mischief, that's essentially property destruction, also graffiti, and that's typically a misdemeanor. And it can be again, a higher level of misdemeanor, depending on the amount of damage, and even enhanced to a higher level, depending on the amount of the amount of damage caused.
Hey, David, we do have a couple questions in the chat.
Oh, sure.
See those.
Let me get out here. Yes. Oh, sorry. Let's see. My video back on here. Thanks for letting me know. Let's see. I'll take this down here. Do we have a certain right to be notified about any ordinance charges at a certain time?
Sorry, that was mine.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm just talking out loud. And then the other question we have is, what does a key facility mean or include? Okay, so I guess as far as to the notice, you're generally assumed to know what the law is. But I guess notice might be most relevant when we're talking about trespass or something like failure to disperse. You know, if you're somewhere that you're generally allowed to be, prior to being arrested, you might be required might be required to be given notice prior to arrest, or at least for to be properly charged with something. But you know, if there's an officer doesn't have to tell you what you're being arrested for or charged with prior to making that. I mean, you can ask them that, but as far as just being generally advised of the law, that's not necessary. Key facility, that's kind of typically any government building or other non-government buildings could be considered that, like a utility. That's a good point. I just saw that about curfew. That's again, you know, you don't have to be, if you're out after a curfew, to violate that curfew, you don't have to receive any sort of individualized instruction or notice of that. If there's a law, whether it's temporary or permanent, again, you're generally assumed to know what the law is. Can officers order to disperse without cause during an unlawful assembly? So officers can, well, I guess there's kind of two ways of saying it. If you're not, I guess there's kind of like a legal and practical question. If there's if you're not doing anything illegal and officers tell you to do something, and i.e. they're giving it a unlawful order, I guess the kind of how to deal with that is a practical question. If you're at a protest or a demonstration and you're not trying to get arrested, I mean, even though the officer's order is not lawful, you're going to want to disperse because they might arrest you. And then kind of on the other side, if you're intending or not minding, if you're intending to get arrested, your recourse would be then to your recourse would be to pursue a civil legal action, probably for a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and then the commission of other torts against you. Certainly, you can always, ask the officer, to clarify the order, or ask them if you're being subject to arrest. But the general question about, what to do when you're being met with an unlawful order or unlawful conduct by a police officer is kind of as a practical question. Can officers generally order a crowd to disperse if they're in a public place and expressing their speech, or exercising their constitutional rights? Generally, that wouldn't be lawful, but of course, there's many things that can curtail that right. A public forum that is generally open to the public might be restricted by a special ordinance or a general order. Most obvious example is you have the right to speak and assemble in a park, but most parks have a curfew. So if there's a group of people, gather at a park after sunset, and the park closes at sunset, well, then they can order you to disperse. Kind of addressing the questions of a weapon, I would, if you're going down to a rally or a protest or a demonstration, I would, even if you're in the legal right to have any sort of weapon, even if it's just a small knife, I would strongly disagree that would be a wise decision. Again, even this kind of from a practical standpoint, even if you're demonstrating peacefully and you tell officers when you're approached that you have a weapon, again, even if it's a small knife, that just is a very unwise decision, just because of how officers would react to that situation. Because even if you're in the right, you can't undo an action by an officer. So it's kind of the same way as if you're stopped by an officer, when you're speeding or not, should you have to be respectful and deferential and kowtow to an officer? No, but what are you trying to do? All right, I'll jump back into the slides, and yeah, please just let me know. I'm gonna try it another way so I can maybe see my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint right now? You can't. Okay, that's good. Okay. Let's see. I'll jump back in here. Okay. Okay, obstructing traffic, another common charge, especially these days, probably up there with disorderly conduct. That's recklessly knowing or intentionally obstructing vehicular or pedestrian traffic, which is a misdemeanor. and it involves a motor vehicle, which it probably is if you're on the roadway. That's a Class A misdemeanor. That probably, practically speaking, kind of going back to notice, is something that you would have to be probably have to receive some sort of verbal notice, at least from an officer, to disperse before you're arrested or certainly charged with it. Otherwise, everyone who is jaywalking could be potentially charged with, obstructing traffic. Now kind of moving from common charges to what happens if you encounter police. Broadly speaking, there's kind of three ways that you would encounter an officer. One is a consensual encounter. Second would be a brief detention or a Terry stop from the Supreme, it's called Terry stop from the Supreme Court case Terry versus Ohio, or an arrest. And I'll just kind of briefly touch on all those. A consensual encounter is what it sounds like, or maybe not what it sounds like, but as far as with a police officer, an officer, I think people know this, but just to be clear, an officer can come up and try to talk to you or anyone, generally speaking, if you're out in the world for whatever reason. You don't have to have probable cause or reasonable suspicion or anything. They can come up and talk to you. But in the same way, you don't have to talk to them. And generally speaking, unless you have a really good reason, don't. And sometimes it could be clear or not, and sometimes based on the nature of the situation or the tenor of their questioning, you might need to clarify. And you can say, officer, am I under arrest? Am I being detained? Am I free to go? If you are not sure, ask. And if they say you're free to leave, leave. Again, there's, other situations where you may be compelled or need to talk to them, but generally speaking, officers are not there to help you. They're there to get you in trouble, or they're there to get someone in trouble. So, but again, just because officers need a reason to make you talk to them, that doesn't mean that you can't voluntarily engage with them and they can't voluntarily engage with you. And that's the vast majority of communication between police and the public. It's voluntary. Brief detentions. A brief detention, again, a Terry stop, that can, an officer can detain you briefly if they have reasonable suspicion, and this again comes out from the Supreme Court case Terry versus Ohio, if they have reasonable suspicion that you've committed a crime or violated an ordinance. So if you're speeding, an officer can detain you. And they can ask you to identify yourself, and you have to identify yourself. There's particular situations where you don't have to identify yourself, but generally speaking, if an officer asks you to identify yourself either by giving them your ID or telling them your name, address, and date of birth. But critically, you don't have to, besides identifying yourself, you don't have to, and generally speaking, you shouldn't provide any other information. As we'll touch on when we talk about being arrests, tell them that you do not wish to speak with them, and that if you're being detained or under arrest, you want to speak to an attorney. Brief detentions, again, require a violation of some law, but beyond the detention, if we're talking about a search, that doesn't just require a suspicion of criminal activity or an ordinance violation. That requires the officer to believe that you are armed in some way. So if you're jaywalking, an officer can't come up to you and do a cavity search. And even in the case of a detention, that's generally restricted to the outside of your clothes. Arrests. Arrests require either probable cause that a crime has occurred or a warrant. And a warrant is a judicial determination that there's probable cause to arrest you. An officer, generally speaking, will tell you that you're under arrest. Again, if you're not clear, ask. During an arrest, whether you're the arrestee or a legal observer, watch for and document as much as you can. Try to get the officer's name, try to identify any witnesses, try to photograph anything you can, film anything you can, ask to speak to your attorney if you're under arrest. Again, after you've identified yourself, stop talking. You'd be surprised that essentially no one stops talking and thinks that I'm assuming, I think if you kind of try, because you're a human being, you think if you talk and try to be reasonable and pleasant with an officer and helpful, that will help you out. It will not. Identify yourself, close your mouth, ask to speak to an attorney. You do not have the right to resist arrest. Resisting arrest means more or less doing anything that an officer tells you not to do. Kind of touching back on the discussion earlier, if an officer uses their authority to arrest you in an unlawful manner, your recourse is to file a civil lawsuit. And kind of practically speaking, if you resist arrest, obviously there's practical adverse consequences that can happen at the time. Kind of going back to the situation, if you're planning on being arrested, even more so, it's important to prepare. Talk to friends, talk to fellow organizers, talk to fellow protesters, let them know what you're going to do, what you're being expected to do. Have, if at all possible, legal observers present, if not other witnesses. Have contact information with you. Have bail funds, bail money available. If you're planning to be arrested, I think it goes without speaking, do not have anything on you that would lead to further charges. Do not have anything of value. It might come up lost at the jail. Do not have a cell phone with you at all possible. Do carry an ID.
David, we have a few questions in the chat about being arrested.
Okay. All right. Okay, so if you ask if I'm being arrested or why I'm being arrested and an officer doesn't respond, that's a good question. If an officer takes you physically into custody and isn't saying whether or not you're being under arrest, I probably, if a court tells you, or if a court would examine it, they would say it was communicated to you that you're under arrest. It's a good question. They don't have to tell you why you're being arrested, but you should certainly ask. And I guess if an officer is not telling you whether or not you're being arrested, that could certainly play into a defense you have against, say, resisting arrest, or come up on the civil side if you're bringing an allegation against police for something like unlawful arrest. On the criminal side, it'd be hard for an officer to say that you're resisting arrest, or it would be more difficult for an officer to say you're resisting arrest if you could reasonably say, hey, listen, I didn't know I was being under arrest. I asked an officer, they said they wouldn't tell me. How much money should you have for bail money? That's a good question. Bail's set at, from a few $1,000s to an extraordinary amount. Typically, if you're posting bond, it's 10%. But fortunately, under new criminal rules of procedure that came into place this year, bond should be being set fairly low or not at all, unless the prosecutor can show that you're some sort of particular risk or been charged with a serious crime. So I'm going to touch on this just down the road, but cell phone's really important. If you're going to get arrested, try not to have your phone on you, and regardless whether you're a protester or a legal observer, have a lock on it. Better yet, have a lock on it and put a sticker on it. There's very good case law on protection of a cell phone from search. An officer, it's not lawful for an officer just to pick up your phone and start going through it, regardless of whether or not it's locked. But it's a extra level of protection to have it locked and to have a sticker on it. Let's see. Kind of like a sticker on the outside. A sticker. Where could you get it? You could. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, I still think, has one, and the ACLU. I mean, it doesn't have to be from them. I think you can order, but it just says, "I do not consent to a search of my phone." Something like that. Or I mean, I guess you could even write it on there. Let's see. I'm going to also touch on this a little bit later, I think. But so as far as identifying yourself, if you're not doing anything at all wrong, and an officer doesn't have reason to believe that you're doing anything at all wrong or illegal, you don't have to identify yourself. But if you're walking down the street or driving down the road, there's a million things an officer can say you've done wrong, or at least say they thought reasonably you might have done wrong. So there's probably a very narrow set of circumstances where you can make that argument that you weren't doing anything wrong or even perceived to be doing anything reasonably wrong. And it's a Class C misdemeanor for failing to identify yourself. So you don't even have to be guilty of any underlying crime to be charged with failure to identify yourself. And if you don't want to talk to an officer, the easiest way is to give them, your driver's license or another photo ID. So if you're not doing anything wrong and you're not breaking any law, and there's no way for you to be perceived to have breaking any law, no, an officer can't ask you to identify yourself. But it's very difficult, especially even in the moment, to know whether or not that's the case. I certainly have had cases and had a lawsuit where we could show that the plaintiff was arrested for failing to identify himself, and there is no probable cause or even reasonable suspicion that this individual had violated any crime or any ordinance. But that's a tough case to make. And if you're not wanting to be arrested, that's probably not the hill to die on. Okay, and I'll take one more question, and I'll try to speed through the rest of the slides, just I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. And thank you for notifying me of the questions. Do you have to explicitly say that that you wish not that you're using your rights to speak if not to speak if arrested? No, you can just stop. You cannot talk to them, and again, you shouldn't. But if you're in custody and you're being interrogated, if you say, I do not wish to speak to you anymore, I want to speak to my attorney, the officers or prosecutors or law enforcement in general, they can't continue to question you. So that's kind of the effect of invoking your rights not to speak to them, speak to officers if you're in custody. So if you just sat there and were quiet, officers could continue to interrogate you, and that will break down most people. If officers can come back and talk to you later, if you say that you don't wish to speak to them, how long they have to wait and what they can ask you, there's not a precise defined period of time, but at least they'll leave you alone for a while, or they should leave you alone for a while. And if they don't, if you say something during that period of time, that can probably be struck from the evidence, and hopefully that'll give you time to consult with an attorney, and then they can't talk to you at all if you don't want to, and they have to go with your attorney. So it gets them to stop. If you're in custody and they're trying to interrogate you, it gets them to stop pestering you, at least for a certain period of time. All right, I'm gonna power through these slides, and then I'll take calls at the. All right. And I should say that I forgot to say that I need to thank fellow NLG attorneys for putting this PowerPoint together. I stole this from them with their permission. I believe this is put together by Jesse Cook, who's a criminal defense attorney in Indianapolis, and Laura Paul, who was a criminal defense attorney in Indiana, is now. We should all feel bad for her. She's out in California, so with the federal public defender. Anyway, so yes, being arrested is no joke. There's, even if all charges are eventually dismissed against you, and the charges were so wrong that you can bring a federal lawsuit against them, it's a big deal. Even misdemeanors are a big deal, okay? And you should really think twice, and I would say don't, if you're asking me. I mean, don't plan to get arrested if if you're on parole, or you have a conviction that could lead to much more serious charges, including a felony, if you receive a subsequent conviction or have been charged. And I bolded this: if you're not a U.S. citizen, even if you're undocumented or even not a full citizen, even if you have some sort of legal status, particularly in this climate right now, it's the adverse consequences can be very severe, even if it's for something relatively minor. People who have any sort of, even misdemeanors and things that even to an average person wouldn't seem like a big deal, immigration is going to make a big deal out of it if they can. So, that includes obviously the most immediate consequences of being deported or being held in immigration detention, or denial of your application to adjust your status in the future. And again, I'm just going to kind of go through these pretty quick. if you're booked, they're gonna search you. They're going to probably look through all your stuff. But when you're booked in, you should try to assess the situation as closely as possible. I don't have to tell anyone here, or particularly anyone in jail, that you want to get out as fast as you can, for obvious reasons, because you don't want to be in jail, and also it's a lot easier to address your legal concerns once you're out. If you're arrested for any reason, even if it's for a speeding ticket, they can search you, including a body cavity search. Let's see. Okay, you have the right to remain silent. Don't talk to police. Everyone knows this. You shouldn't talk to police, but everyone does. I mean, most people do. So it's very hard because it's a extremely stressful situation. And it's very unnerving and very unsettling. But if you can, identify yourself, particularly if you're under arrest, say that you wish to speak to an attorney. Another thing just at the jail real quick that most people might know, but even if they're told by recording on the phone, your phone calls are recorded and prosecutors do listen to them. So if you're talking to someone who's not your attorney, which are supposed to be private, but sometimes it doesn't seem like they are, don't say anything on the phone that you don't want a cop to hear. Cell phones, we kind of touched on. Pass through all that. Something that most people again know, and it really is it's your right. You have the right to photograph and videotape police. Sometimes, if you're not automatically uploading something to the cloud or a third-party platform, that's good, because even though police officers know and are told that people can record them, they sometimes do try to seize or break people's recording devices, and that's always a great video when you are lawfully recording a police officer and they're showing on video grabbing your phone. That not fun in the moment, but fun in retrospect. Okay, kind of just going over to some more legal observer training specific issues. A legal observer, you're there as an ostensible third party, neutral, to document what's going on. Okay. So what you're there to do is watch and document the protesters and the police. Okay. Again, you're not, even though our sympathies are with the protesters, it's important for practical and legal reasons that you're separate and apart, both spatially and philosophically. You're not a protester. You're not speaking on behalf of the protesters. You're not speaking to the media. It's fine to gather information, whether it's from protesters or police, but that's your function. So okay, so there's kind of three main things that legal observers do. Probably the first one and most important one is that you're providing there, if needed, support in the case of criminal or civil litigation by being a witness. So in the case that there's criminal charges or a civil suit on the other side, you are collecting legally protected information to provide to the individual's legal team. And you are there to provide evidence if sought by them. So that's another practical reason that you're not part of the demonstration, because in the same way that an attorney would never want to be called as a witness against their client. And then kind of, not I want to say secondarily, but the other kind of important functions are that you're kind of serving as a serving in a court watch function. You are there. You're separate and apart. Police are aware that you are there recording and documenting things. Protesters are aware that you're there and keeping an eye on things. So your presence is there as a authority and a neutral to let everyone know that that you're keeping tabs on things. As far as being a legal observer, as far as a National Lawyers Guild legal observer, what you want to do as a legal observer to, and one of your functions is marking and demarcating yourself separate from protesters. Wear a National Lawyers Guild legal observer hat. That's the kind of the lime green hats that you might see down at protests. And I do have information for ordering those at the end of the presentation. As a legal observer, you're going to mark yourself physically as separate. That a great way to do that is to wear the hat. If you have a lime green vest, which you can get wherever, that's a good way too. You see this guy has an armband, and it looks like some pretty cool suspenders. Kind of maybe think about yourself as a reporter if you kind of want to know a way to kind of imagine yourself. Bring a notebook, bring a phone, bring a camera, have your bar card. When you're there, you're keeping tabs on everything as much as you can. You're watching for you're kind of just generally assessing the situation, and you're watching for in particular any wrongdoing or any actions of concern by police. And I'm going to go through this quickly. While observing, again, watch demonstrators, watch protesters, especially in particular in their interactions with police. If you see someone actually getting arrested, try to be able to try to identify who that is, try to identify who the law enforcement officers are engaged in the arrest, watch the manner of arrest, document any witnesses and their contact information. Some police tactics to watch, for lack of better terms, watch any sudden movements by police. If police start to move or there's any action, get in there, figure out what's going on. In particular, of course, watch for any violent actions by police, whether that's using their hands, or of course guns, or supposedly less lethal forms of the use of weapons. Okay, and I'm going to throw up the contact information there. So we have our contact information, Indiana at NLG.org. NLG.org is just kind of for general information about the Guild. If you would like to join the Guild as an attorney, law student, legal worker, please do. If you do, send an email to Indiana at NLG.org, and we'll put you on our listserv if you want, where we kind of do a shout out to protest, shout out for legal observers, and just kind of generally provide other information about our meetings and things that we're trying to do, including coordinated response to everything that's been going down in the last couple weeks. So, and of course, there's a link there to order National Lawyers Guild Legal Observer hats, nlg.org/lo.hats. That's not required for being a legal observer, but it is nice, and it's probably the most easily recognizable mark of a legal observer. If you can't get one, try to get a green hat. So that is what I have as far as the formal presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions people might have, or post in the comments.
Yeah, we do have a few questions that have been pending in the chat. Megan Collier asked, can you expand on the medication issue if you're arrested?
Sure, yeah, so medication issue, so if you have any medication that you take on a regular basis or at all, that's generally confiscated at least for a period of time once you go into jail. You know, you have a right to adequate medical care while you're in jail, but you know, there's usually some sort of screening process. And you know, even if you know, jail officials don't return your medication or provide a reasonable substitute or in an adequate period of time, if you need that medication, you know, you can't undo physical harm that you suffer, whether that and that can include medication for, you know, physical issues or mental health issues. And it does happen a lot. Probably one of the biggest issues I've seen in recent years is people who are on Xanax or other benzos, and if you're on that medication for a long period of time and it's suddenly stopped, even for a relatively short period of time, like a day or two, which happens a lot for all medications, you can suffer serious adverse physical reactions to that. So if you require, or you know, another thing is, you know, regular insulin injections. Again, what jail officials are supposed to do or even constitutionally required to do and what they actually do are two different things. So your remedy we have at law is to file a lawsuit for injunctive relief or damages down the road. But, you know, if someone in jail, you're dealing with the here and now. Okay, I'm just looking through here.
One person said that they've had their face and license plate documented by police several times at various protests and demonstrations. Would this undermine their credibility as an observer?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I don't think that would ever be an issue. You know, if you're there and you're clearly marked as an observer and you're not engaged in the protests, I think, you know, if an officer, you know, approached you and said, "Hey, listen, I don't think you're really a legal observer. I think you're a protester or a troublemaker," and try to do something about it, you know, that would, you know, that wouldn't be illegal, and, you know, unless absent some sort of extraordinary circumstances where they can, you know, accuse you of some sort of, you know, unconscionable subterfuge or something like that. So yeah, so I don't think being a protester in the past would be any sort of bar to being a legal observer now, or give police officers any sort of reason to do anything, you know, untowards to you. Yeah.
And then Professor Johnson asked if you could address the COVID-19 limit on gatherings of 50 people, or whether like the police could technically enforce that during a protest.
Yes, those orders could be enforced, and they would probably be upheld. I don't think in Indiana there is. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that there's any gathering limits still in effect. I mean, certainly, or, you know, groups of people, whether that's churches or other assemblies, are, I think, voluntarily observing gathering limits. I don't, as far as size of gatherings, I don't think there's any limits. But if there is, and I'm wrong, or there is in the future, limits on gatherings, or, you know, the number of people in a space, whether that's a public, indoors or outdoors, officers could enforce that. Now, there might be some litigation around whether that's a lawful order, you know, and there would be weighing of interests, you know, the weighing of the government to, you know, take public health measures to stop the spread of a pandemic weighed against, people's right to, gather and assemble. I mean, and we've seen some litigation around that, mainly with, religious services and gatherings. And probably if we weren't dealing with religious, institutions and more just kind of, the concerns of protesters or other activists in a gathering space and their rights, it would be a similar analysis, not exactly the same, but it'd be similar. It'd be a weighing of, okay, government, has an obligation to do this and a right to do this, and people have constitutional rights to do this. Is this, are these reasonable measures? Things like that.
All right. Lisa Welch asked if you need to have a legal background to be a legal observer.
No, you don't. I would say often legal observers are attorneys or law students or other legal workers, but you don't have to be. No.
All right. And then Lane Mathers asked if legal observers can play a role in documenting harassment from other citizens, people who are not police.
Yes, good. That's a really good question. And that's funny. I hadn't thought about that before. I thought about this weekend. This weekend, I was a legal observer at the rally in Fort Wayne down here on Saturday, and as I was pedaling up there to the protest on my bike, I was passed by a car with a sticker with the I don't know what the formal name for it is, but kind of like that OK symbol, that the alt-right uses, and I was like, uh-oh, that's a whole other thing I didn't even think about. People of, whether it's people on their alt-right or just alt-right fascists coming down there to start trouble, either overtly or surreptitiously. That's important to watch because I would say that's something that typically happens, but it's certainly something that has and can happen. And obviously there are sometimes an escalation of events between people on one side getting into a conflict with people on another side that draw on police. And I think we know typically who police will side with. So it's good to keep an eye on those type of individuals.
All right, everyone. Unfortunately, we are over time, so I'm going to have to cut off questions there. But David, is your email open for further questions or anything?
Absolutely, yeah. The best way is to indiananlg.org. If there's a request for whether it's legal observer training in the future, whether it's if there's criminal defense or civil litigation requests, we're as a chapter we're trying to keep up and help coordinate a response. So at minimum, we hope to be able to at least point you in the right direction. So again, thank you to everyone for hosting and bearing with me. So please just email us. The easiest way to get a hold of me if there's any questions following the presentation.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That concludes our event. I'm so sorry for those disruptions at the beginning. I think we all gained a few gray hairs through this presentation, but thank you everyone for fighting through it and sticking through. We still ended up with a pretty large audience and a very engaged audience. So thanks for your questions. Please be smart and safe this weekend while exercising your First Amendment rights. Be sure to wear a mask and please use the skills you learned today to protect each other. And have a good weekend. Thanks everyone.